Okay, so we're almost done. We're in chapter 15, just one more to go. In this chapter, we're going to talk about the urinary system, fluid electrolyte balance, as well as acid-base balance. So let's talk about the urinary system to get us started. First of all, the organs dealing with the urinary system include the kidneys, the ureters, which are the little tubes coming from the kidneys, the urinary bladder, and the urethra, which is the tube leaving the bladder going out to the external environment, or going out to the world, as I like to say. It functions in filtrating the blood plasma, reabsorbing essential nutrients before they leave the body, secreting non-essential substances, right, in the form of urine, ultimately to help maintain homeostasis and maintain fluid and electrolyte balance. So let's talk about the external anatomy of the kidney. So they're kind of reddish organs, hence kidney beans, which are both shaped like kidneys as well as have a similar color. They're reddish because of all of the capillaries within them. They have a very rich blood content. They are shaped like kidney beans, as I said. They're about the size of a bar of soap, a little smaller than the palm of your hand. They're found on either side of the vertebral column, between the peritoneum and the back wall of the abdominal cavity. So they're actually not contained within the peritoneum, which is that serous membrane that contains all of your abdominal organs. They are called retroperitoneal because they're behind that peritoneum. They're at about the 12th thoracic vertebrae and the first and third lumbar vertebrae. The 11th and 12th pair of ribs help to protect the top part of the kidneys, but otherwise there's not much bone there to protect them. They're actually surrounded in a very fatty capsule that helps insulate and protect them. The right kidney is actually slightly lower than the left because the liver is a huge organ in our digestive system, which takes up more space on that right-hand side. So they are encapsulated, as I mentioned, in a big connective tissue sheath that helps to maintain the shape of the kidneys as well as to protect it against trauma. And as I mentioned, there's lots and lots of adipose surrounding the renal capsule that help cushion the kidneys for more trauma protection. That, along with the connective tissue, that's going to help anchor the kidney to the posterior wall of the abdominal cavity. There you can see where they are. You can notice that right is lower than the left. You can see the little hats on top of the kidneys as adrenal glands. They are ultimately there to regulate blood volume and blood pressure. They regulate blood composition. They regulate blood pH. They secrete hormones. They excrete wastes. They're supplied by the renal veins. And coming from them, I should say renal veins and renal arteries. In this case, you only see the renal veins, which is taking blood from the kidneys and going back up to the inferior vena cava. But these little tubes coming down from the kidneys are the ureters, and they go all the way down. Look how long they are. You might not realize how long they are, but they go all the way down to the urinary bladder, which is going to expand as it fills with urine. Urine is being made in the kidneys. That epithelial tissue is going to flatten, sending information to the special stretch receptors to say, hey, your bladder's full. And then you will go to the bathroom, and the urine will be expelled through the urethra, which is just this little tube here. It's a different length in males than in females because of the external anatomy for males. Here you can see the actual picture of a kidney. This must have been very tedious for whoever dissected this because typically the kidneys are very, very, very tightly packed in a layer of fat. So whoever did this must have taken a lot of time to rip away all of that adipose. You can see the renal artery, renal vein coming in here. This is a special area called the renal pelvis. That little kind of curve in the kidney is called a renal pelvis. And then here you see that ureter, which is going to lead down to the urinary bladder. So let's talk about some functions of the kidneys. Overall, regulating blood volume. Excess water can be returned to the blood if the blood needs extra water in it. If blood pressure is a little low, it can also help to eliminate water in the body. If the fluid level in the plasma is too high, if blood pressure is too high, then the kidneys are going to increase their secretion of water. Also, to regulate blood pressure, as I mentioned, renin is the specific enzyme that is secreted by the kidneys to help increase blood pressure. They also regulate blood composition and blood pH, regulating blood ion levels, regulating blood pH by regulating those hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions within the blood. As I mentioned, it produces some hormones, calcitriol, which is the active form of vitamin D. Calcitriol is going to play a role in regulating calcium homeostasis. Calcitriol is going to increase absorption of calcium from the intestines. And then erythropoietin, which is going to stimulate the production of red blood cells. Again, because your kidneys have such an intimate relationship with the blood, because it's filtering the blood, it's going to know if your red blood cell count's a little too low. It will secrete erythropoietin and get that red blood cell count back up. It also helps to excrete waste products. The urine is going to remove any metabolic waste such as ammonia, urea, bilirubin, creatinine, uric acid, etc. All of those can be removed through the urinary system. The urine is going to take foreign substances out as well, like drugs and other environmental toxins that may have been in your body. So the two main regions of the inside of our kidney are the cortex and the medulla. The cortex is where the majority of the blood supply is, and then the medulla has lots of tubules that are going to collect and concentrate that filtrate, which is the kind of pre-urine liquid that forms in the kidneys. Filtrate is what the urine is called before it is kind of finalized in concentration, and we'll talk about the mechanics of that. So here you can see the internal anatomy of our kidney. You see that area that I called the renal pelvis, which is this like indentation area of our kidney. This outermost area here, this is our cortex, and then the medulla is this inner area that's a little darker in color. You have these special areas here called renal pyramids. So here's a pyramid, here's a pyramid, here's a pyramid, etc. Basically, these pyramids and the cortex have structures within them called nephrons. And these nephrons are where that blood gets filtered. And so, as these nephrons are filtering the blood, they're creating something called filtrate. And that filtrate then drains, where did my mouse go? Here it is. Then drains out of the medulla, out through the pyramids, into this kind of gray section, which is called the minor calyx. The minor calyx corresponds to each of the pyramids. So here's a minor calyx, here's a minor calyx, here's a minor calyx, here's a minor calyx. The word calyx in Latin actually means cup. So this is the little cup or minor cup. And these little cups drain into the big cup, which is called the major calyx. That's this area here. And this major calyx is going to then drain out the renal pelvis, this kind of indentation area of our kidney, and then down into the ureter. From the ureter, it gets to the urinary bladder. So let's talk about what's in the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis is made of that minor calyx and the major calyx. The minor calyx is the smaller cup-like structures at the very rim of the renal pelvis, draining from the medulla through those ducts, and then the major calyx is receiving urine from the minor calyx connecting to the ureter. There you can see them again, the minor and major calyx, minor calyx, draining into the major calyx, draining into the ureter. Let's talk about renal blood flow. 20 to 25% of your cardiac output is going to your kidneys via those renal arteries. So in other words, just about at any given time in your body, your kidneys have 20 to 25% of all of your blood. The renal artery, which is supplying the blood to the kidney, is going to divide into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller vessels, which eventually become these arterioles, which are called afferent arterioles. These afferent arterioles divide again into something called the glomerulus. It's a fun word to say. Say it with me, glomerulus, and a special capillary network. So let's look at how this is set up. So just to review, you have that outer cortex. You have these little pyramid structures that are within the medulla. You can see here this renal artery, which branches, and then these branches branch some more, and then those branches branch some more, and so on and so forth, until you get to this small structure up here, and you can kind of see this little red line coming right here to this little circle area. Well, that's what you see here. You have this afferent arteriole, which is the end of that renal artery, and you can imagine there would be lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of them all around this cortex layer. That afferent arteriole dumps into something called the glomerulus. The glomerulus is where the initial filtering of the blood occurs. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Let's just focus now on blood flow, not so much urine formation. So that blood flows through that afferent arteriole into the glomerulus, and then out of the glomerulus through an efferent arteriole. Then it's going to flow through something called the peritubular capillaries, which are these little guys here. This diagram is calling it the vasa recta. It's pretty much the same thing. And then these peritubular capillaries are going to lead back to something called a cortical radiate vein, which is this little blue vein here. So it's taking the blood away. And that blue vein joins back to another major vein here called an arcuate vein, and then you have an interlobar vein, and then eventually you get back to your renal vein. So if we take a look at this path of blood flow on this flow chart here, you start off with your renal artery. The renal artery subdivides into the segmental arteries. The segmental arteries are going to branch off into these cortical radiate arteries. Cortical radiate arteries are going to radiate out into the cortex. And then those are going to branch into the arcuate arteries. These arcuate arteries are then going to form, this is a small typo here, you have cortical radiate arteries twice. Shouldn't have that. Those arcuate arteries are then going to go into this glomerulus. And then up here you see that afferent arteriole going into that glomerulus, then the efferent arteriole coming out of the glomerulus, taking blood through those peritubular capillaries. In this case, they're calling it the vasa recta. It's just a special type of peritubular capillary. Then going through the cortical radiant veins that you see here, through the arcuate veins that you see here, through the interlobar veins, the segmental veins, which aren't listed. That flow chart is not very accurate. And then eventually to the renal vein. Don't be too concerned with the overall nuts and bolts of every single layer of blood flow, but you should understand that the blood flows in, it goes to smaller and smaller arterioles, eventually gets to a glomerulus. That's kind of the big picture here. So let's talk about that glomeruli. The glomeruli are going to unite to form that efferent arteriole that I showed you. Those efferent arterioles divide into those peritubular capillaries, and those peritubular capillaries form larger and larger and larger veins, which fuse together to become the renal vein, which then fuses with the inferior vena cava. Sympathetic neurons of the autonomic nervous system are innervating the blood vessels of the kidney. So under resting conditions, the sympathetic stimulation is low. Afferent and efferent arterioles are relatively dilated. They're nice and large, letting lots of blood in, lots of urines being formed. Everybody's nice and happy. When you're exercising, or if you're having excessive blood loss, like hemorrhaging, your sympathetic stimulation is going to increase. So the afferent arterioles are going to constrict more than the efferent arteriole. So this is going to conserve blood volume, and it's going to allow the greater blood flow to other tissues such as the heart and skeletal muscles. That makes sense when you're exercising or running away from a lion or something like that. You don't necessarily care if your body's making urine efficiently, but you want your muscles to have the blood that they need so that they can move. Let's talk about what a nephron is. So the nephron is the functional unit of the kidney. This is a little structure that was that little yellow structure on that diagram a few slides back, extending from the cortex into the medulla. There's cortical nephrons, which have short loops of Henle that just go minimally into the medulla. And then another type of nephron called a juxtamedullary nephron, which has a very long loop of Henle going deep into the medulla. There's two parts to the nephron. There's what's called the renal corpuscle, and then there's another part called the renal tubule. So here you can see the nitty-gritty details of a glomerulus. In this case, that's really all we're looking at. You see your afferent arteriole here coming in, going into this glomerulus network. This whole area is called the glomerular capsule. Sometimes it's called the Bowman's capsule, but I'll always refer to it as the glomerular capsule. Inside of this capsule are special cells which are kind of loosely connected together. You can see here how they're kind of fringed together very loosely. They're called podocytes. It's a special type of cell here. And what happens is the blood in this afferent arteriole comes in, it's going relatively fast, and then it slams against these podocytes. And as it does that, you can imagine some of the blood, actually a lot of the blood and a lot of the proteins and things, sugars and waste products, etc., that are in the blood are going to then leave the blood. That's kind of going to be shook out of the blood when the blood slams against these podocytes here. All of that stuff is going to kind of bounce out. And then the blood can merrily go on its way out the efferent arteriole. So, let's look at what happens next. Here you can see that afferent arteriole coming in from that cortical radiant artery here, and that blood comes in, slams into those podocytes, dumps some filtrate out into that glomerular capsule, also known as the Bowman's capsule, and then you can see that efferent arteriole leaving the glomerulus right here. So let's talk about what happens to that filtrate after it leaves the glomerular capsule. So the stuff that's slammed out of the blood inside the glomerular capsule is called filtrate. And the filtrate's going to follow this yellow tube. Now notice that this yellow tube is interwoven with arteries. These arteries are going to pick up extra things that may have been knocked out of the blood in the glomerulus, but maybe it wasn't supposed to be knocked out. So it's going to kind of recollect its belongings, so to speak. So, after all of those extra things, extra sugars, maybe extra ions, etc., are kind of slammed out of the blood within the glomerulus, all of that stuff, now called filtrate, is going to pass through this structure called the nephron. The nephron is this whole yellow tube structure. So the first stop through our nephron, other than our glomerular capsule, is called the PCT, or proximal convoluted tubule. This is the very first section of the tubule. This is made of simple cuboidal cells, and there's special microvilli in this area to pick up anything extra that may not, or that maybe shouldn't have been taken out of the blood originally. So maybe some ions, maybe some other proteins that have accidentally been knocked out, etc. Once the filtrate, where'd my arrow go? Here it is. Once the filtrate passes through this PCT, this proximal convoluted tubule, it's going to go down through what's called the nephron loop. Sometimes it's called the loop of Henle. It's the same thing. So this, keep losing my mouse. Here we go. So this loop of Henle is made of a descending section where the filtrate's going to go down, 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 and you can see as it's going down, it's interwoven with these peritubular capillaries. Again, these peritubular capillaries are rebalancing the ion concentrations in the filtrate, making sure that whatever's going to leave the body as urine is absolutely positively the only stuff that needs to go. In other words, it's going to reabsorb anything extra that shouldn't leave the body. It's going to maybe redeposit some things that should leave the body. So this is kind of the last call, so to speak, for getting things in and out of that pre-urine, which is still called filtrate at this point. So then the filtrate, which passes down this descending loop, is now going to go through the ascending loop. Goodness gracious, sorry, my mouse is going crazy today apparently. Come on, little mouse. Okay. Go up our ascending loop right here. And then it's going to pass through, the filtrate, I should say, is going to pass through one last stop through the nephron. It's called the DCT, or the distal convoluted tubule. The distal convoluted tubule is kind of the last stop before the filtrate begins to go into what's called the collecting duct. So the distal convoluted tubule is right here. It leads into something called our collecting duct. The collecting duct. This is actually the last call for substances. Substances leaving the filtrate. They're finalized in this collecting duct. And then that collecting duct dumps into the minor calyx. The minor calyx will dump into the major calyx. The major calyx will dump into the ureter. The ureter dumps into the urinary bladder. So that's kind of the flow and formation of urine from filtrate, and the filtrate, of course, comes from the excess stuff in your blood. Let's talk about Let's kind of break it down a little bit more because I'm sure you didn't catch it the first time I said everything, especially because my mouse was acting a little funny there. So the renal corpuscle is where the blood plasma is filtered. There's two parts. There's the glomerulus itself, and there's the capsule, the glomerular capsule. So the glomerulus itself is that structure that's made up of all of those podocytes with those slits. They're kind of fringed together to allow that blood filtrate to kind of slam out of the afferent arteriole. The capsule itself is kind of like the catcher's mitt or the cup that catches all of those things that slam out of the blood as it's going in. Then you have the tubule. The tubule itself, the renal tubule, is made of that PCT, that proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, which has a descending and ascending arm, and then the distal convoluted tubule. From that distal convoluted tubule, the filtrate, this slide is calling it urine. It's actually still filtrate at this point. That filtrate goes from the distal convoluted tubule into the collecting duct. Here again, you see what I was talking about. The glomerulus itself is made of those special podocytes. The glomerular capsule is that catcher's mitt going around those special capillaries of those podocytes. I feel like I'm going backwards here. Am I going backwards? No, it's just another slide of the same thing that we've already gone through. So let's look at it again. You have your afferent arteriole going into the glomerulus. That filtrate's going to be captured by the glomerular capsule. The blood is going to continue with the efferent arteriole, which will eventually form all of these peritubular capillaries and go into the veins, eventually leading to the renal vein. That filtrate that was removed from the blood within the glomerular capsule is going to go through the PCT, the descending limb of our nephron loop, the ascending limb of our nephron loop, the DCT, the collecting duct, and then the minor calyx. And then the minor calyx leads to the major calyx, etc., etc. So let's talk about how this filtrate becomes urine. We kind of looked at the flow of events. Let's look at what actually is happening as that filtrate passes through the nephron. So the kidney is going to filter that blood plasma. It's going to reabsorb things like water, ions, and glucose, things that the body should need and can store for later use. It's going to secrete nitrogen-based products like urea and uric acid. It's going to secrete drugs. It's going to secrete toxins. So there's 3 steps in urine formation. First is glomerular filtration. That's when that afferent arteriole, the blood in the afferent arteriole kind of slams into that glomerulus structure, and the glomerular capsule catches it. That's that glomerular filtration. That's the first step in forming the filtrate that will form urine. Then you have something called tubular reabsorption. So the glomerular filtration rate is basically going to slam the majority of the junk and some good stuff out of the blood. Tubular reabsorption is what is going to occur as that filtrate passes through the PCT, the nephron loop, and the DCT. And so the tubule are basically going to reabsorb almost 99% of what was originally slammed out at the glomerulus. Then you have tubular secretion. Tubular secretion is basically what's left over at the end of the DCT as that filtrate goes into the collecting duct. We say that it's secreted because it's technically not being excreted at that time. It's still in the body. It's just being taken out of the kidneys to go to the bladder at that point. So here you can see the first step, this glomerular filtration. You have your afferent arteriole. This is very, very simplified. Going into the glomerulus, and then slam, all of that stuff comes out. It's captured by your glomerular capsule. And then you have the PCT, you have your nephron loop, you have your DCT, etc. going out. So all along the way in the tubule, you have reabsorption occurring. Reabsorption is when stuff is taken back from the filtrate, and then secretion, which is when things are put back in. Basically, this whole process of hemming and hawing and readjusting ion concentrations before it's eliminated from the body. This is some averages on how much water, protein, sodium, etc. are reabsorbed as well as excreted each day. So for instance, let's look at here, proteins. Almost 2 grams of proteins enter your glomerulus every day. almost all of it is returned back to the blood. Almost none of it is excreted. Just about no protein is going to be excreted unless you're sick for some reason. Check out the sodium. Sodium's filtering 579 grams, 575 grams are reabsorbed. So it's going to excrete very little sodium. What is it excreting a lot of? Well, look at this toxin, urea, builds up in the blood, changing blood pH. Urea, 54 grams of it, 30 grams of it are excreted. That's a pretty high turnover rate. What about creatinine? That's another waste product of metabolism. 1.6 grams are filtered, 1.6 grams is removed. So, the kidney filters about 180 liters a day in males and 150 liters a day in females. That filtration is powered by those net pressures within the renal corpuscle. Tubular reabsorption and secretion are driven by membrane transport processes like diffusion, osmosis, as well as facilitate diffusion and active transport across those renal tubule cells within the PCT and DCT. These are also influenced by filtration flow rate. The faster the flow, the less absorption. The slower the flow, the more absorption. So glomerular filtration occurs within that renal corpuscle. It's dealing with the fluid moving from the glomerulus into that glomerular capsule. There's a 3-layer to that filtration membrane. First, you have those endothelial cells of the glomerular capillaries. Then there's a layer of basal lamina, like a little basement membrane there. Oh, excuse me. And then you have podocytes. Podocytes are those large cells that have those kind of fringed ends to them, allowing the passage of blood plasma, as well as small proteins, to get through into the glomerular capsule. It's also going to prevent the passage of blood cells and larger proteins. So that glomerular filtration is driven by blood pressure. Blood pressure is going to drive that filtration into the capillaries. The blood colloid osmotic pressure and the glomerular capsule pressure oppose filtration. The net filtration pressure is equal to your overall blood pressure minus your blood colloid osmotic pressure and your glomerular capsule pressure. So in other words, your net filtration pressure equals your glomerular